like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like a dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like these old
All right, Z-Man, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me. I apologize in advance if you hear some big, loud noises. There's thunderstorms rumbling through the holler here in the Fortress of Solitude, so it could get kind of noisy. Although I don't know if the mic picks it up or not.
Well, don't worry about it. As someone who lives relatively close to a very popular biker bar, there will almost assuredly be more noise in the background of my audio than yours as someone decides to peel out in their Harley at 8 p.m. on a weekday. Anyway, I wanted to talk with you about the 2024 election. You know, I'm constantly recommending your show. It'll be linked in the description. Highly recommend people check it out. And at the time of recording, your most recent episode is on, obviously, the election, right? Trump v. Harris. And so, you know, when we were speaking earlier, you mentioned that the whole point of that piece was to sort of refocus the conversation about the election. Do you want to describe your sort of thesis with that?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, we are kind of in an interesting time in that this is the Harris people or whoever is behind it is trying to run what I think is the first purely internet election campaign, where they're not trying to deal with reality, the reality of who she is as a physical human being who has had a real history and all the other things that we associate with a living person in meat space. And the same with Tim Walz. They're trying to ignore all that, and instead they're trying to run a campaign that's entirely on the internet. These are two characters who have been reimagined. It's kind of like how Hollywood reboots an old franchise. This is the new version of something. What was the last Star Wars? The Acolyte. It's actually a pretty good analogy. She's the Acolyte. Brought in under old Joe Biden, the old white guy, and she's going to push him aside and take the role as the strong, diverse female. And it really is kind of the campaign that they're running. And you get all the gaslighting with it, the fake polls, and all the other stuff that comes with it. But there was a time before the internet where this stuff sort of happened too, and they used to call it the silly season. It was just this period of just ridiculousness. The best time for a presidential candidate, the best times they have are when they announce they're going to run because they're all full of hope and optimism. When they secure the nomination, that's a great time. And then when they actually have their nominating convention. Well, Harris had all this stuff packed into a month. Usually it's spread out over a long period of time, so there's ups and downs, and this was all packed into a month, along with this massive internet gaslighting operation that is very effective on people who spend all their time online. But for normal people who are out in the world, who are in the business world, or have friends in the real world who go outside, who actually know what reality is versus the internet, this all seems, it just comes off as rather strange and weird. But even people who live normal lives outside of the internet spend time online, so they bump up against this stuff, and there's a real conflict there. And when you look at the facts that matter, though, in an election, well, this internet campaign is probably not going to have a big impact on it. It'll fade. It'll run its course. We've seen this with things like the Ukraine war. We've seen it. We saw it with the whole Russian collusion stuff. After a while, people started to laugh at it, and it became ridiculous, and it went away. No one talks about it anymore. And I think that may actually happen with Harris. That all of this big hullabaloo online is kind of it's peaking too early. She's going to crash, and sometime I think they're having debates in September, something like that. 3-4 weeks from now, all this sugar high from the gaslighting campaign and the silly season, the excitement of having the new, diverse, strong female character, that'll all fade away. And of course, what happens, we've all done this, where you have a big starchy, high carbohydrate diet, or a meal rather, and you crash afterwards. And I think this will probably happen. Probably by the end of this month, end of September, we'll be back to reality, and she will be a long shot, because look, it's really hard to sell people on someone who is this odd and this unknown. I mean, she's the high risk candidate. Oddly enough, Trump has become the safe candidate, the safe choice. And if you're looking around and it's an uncertain world, the economy is not great. Inflation is obviously still a problem. People are starting to really to think about their household budgets and their savings and their retirement. A lot of people who are thinking about retirement, you think about it, you got 28% of the population, the voting population, are technically baby boomers. And you throw in my generation, Gen Xers, so you're probably talking 32, 33% or something like that. Well, as you get older, you're less tolerant for uncertainty. So as the population gets older, it gets more conservative. It looks for the safer choice. And oddly enough, I mean, it's kind of amusing in a way, but Trump has become the safe choice. You know what you're going to get with him. And so, I mean, if I were a betting person, or if someone said, hey, we're going to hire you and you get $1 million if you run the campaign or help the campaign win, which side do you want to take? I'm going to take the Trump side, because there's just so much more that he can do to win versus Harris. And I say this as someone, I have all the caveats about Trump and democracy and what he can accomplish and all that stuff. Just looking at this purely in the game that it is, that in a couple of weeks from now, we're all going to be thinking that, geez, Trump looks pretty good. And I think that's the way it's going to turn out. And I'm not guaranteeing it, because there's the whole shenanigans problem. But I think the shenanigans problem may turn out to be a bigger problem for Harris than for Trump, because I think I said in my show that if you look at what the hell's her name, Karen Whitmer.
Gretchen Whitmer, I believe.
Gretchen Whitmer. I keep calling her Karen. It's kind of funny. But whatever, it doesn't matter. She has her eyes on 2028. Josh Shapiro is thinking about 2028. There's a lot of wealthy people who have been developing Gavin Newsom for 2028. And they have, this is a lot of tech people, a lot of old political money, so Harris losing might not be such a bad thing for a lot of these people. And that means that, Gretchen Whitmer and Josh Shapiro, well, they might not have their shenanigans operation. They might not fortify the election for democracy like they did in 2020, because, well, why do this? And this is not an unusual thing. I don't know if I mentioned this in the show, but gosh, how long ago was this? Scott Brown, when Ted Kennedy dropped dead, they had a special election in Massachusetts, and Scott Brown won the election as a Republican who won the election. And the reason was that the machines in Boston, Springfield, Worcester, Lowell, these were all Democratic mayors who ran the Democratic machine. They sat it out. They didn't like the Democratic nominee. They had personal reasons for it. They didn't put their foot soldiers out there. The Democrat lost. It was a huge upset. The next election, though, which was, well, it would have been, let's see, Obama was already in the White House, so that would have been 2012. So in 2012, when they had Elizabeth Warren, they had a perfect zombie that they wanted. All the Democrats were happy. They put their foot soldiers out. She won in a landslide. So it really tells you how institutional support can make a huge difference. These guys can be real subtle about it and say, well, I don't know. It's not really in my best interest to help you out here, so I'm not going to. And that's another thing that works in Trump's favor. I mean, she really has. When you look at all the states, and I think I went through this. I went through all the different states and looked at polling. I mean, she's got to win them all. She's got to win. She's going to win Minnesota, which I think she'll win. She's got to win Wisconsin. She's got to win Michigan. She's got to win Pennsylvania. She has to win Virginia, which is, no one's talking about Virginia. I keep bringing this up. You look at the polls in Virginia, it's pretty much a dead heat right now. That's a huge problem. And there's a Republican governor there who has already cracked down on the shenanigans, clearing out the phony voters and all that stuff. So she's got to win. She's got to make the 4-cushion bank shot to win. And
it's interesting you bring up Virginia, right? Because as a resident of the state, I've asked the same question, right? Why is no one talking about it? Now, look, right? You've you've lived in the area, you're familiar with the fact that Northern Virginia is effectively a hellscape, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of the start of the Northeast megalopolis. And they've also imported quite a lot of new Americans. So, okay, fair
28%.
enough.
Yeah, 28% of the voters were foreign born, I think, in 2020.
And they were very proud of that fact. But if you look at Glenn Youngkin, right? Glenn Youngkin isn't our type of guy, but he's a canny politician. And he's done a couple things that have kind of showed that, right? So one of the things is he's massively revamped multiple government programs, right? The DMV, the Department of Transportation, the state one, all of those. Now also, right, let's take that same kind of line of reasoning we use towards Gretchen Whitmer, right? What does this person, this governor, what do they have in mind for their political career? I mean, very, very shortly after he was elected, you heard the rumblings, oh, Youngkin's going to run for president. Youngkin's going to run for president. I think he very wisely saw that Trump was going to be a force. He didn't make the mistake that DeSantis made, right? Which is to try and fight Trump. And he lost his political career for it, effectively. Now, again, 4 years of Trump, he's done. Now, admittedly, Youngkin will also be out of office by then. But if he is not only, the man who is able to swing Virginia red, but also hand, the RNC those states, he's an incredible commanding role, right? A very strong possibility for an eventual president. And look, I'm not saying that he is my favorite politician. I want him to succeed in everything he does. But it seems to me as if, all of these kind of individual players all find it in their best interest for Trump to win and not Kamala.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons, and I think, you have to kind of think of politics in that, you have these sort of power centers, if you will, the tech money. Tech money, it was mostly Indian money, came in for Kamala Harris in 2020, and they were very disappointed with the results. She couldn't attract flies. I mean, if she was dead, she would have attracted flies. She was people forget just how awful a candidate she was. I mean, hilariously awful. I mean, one of those candidates I kind of wanted to stick around because it'd just been great material. She would have been a blast. And, so the tech money, they're looking at her and probably not all that enthusiastic. She's not really good. And she's also kind of tangled up into the Clinton machine a little bit. She had a whole bunch of Clinton people working for her. And then you have Wall Street. I mean, she's talking about these crackpot ideas. I mean, she sounds like Bernie Sanders, for goodness sakes, talking about taxing unrealized capital gains. I mean, that may be the dumbest idea I've ever heard in politics. I mean, look, I'm no young guy. I have heard a lot of incredibly stupid things. I was talking to someone today about this. This was a normie, someone who had probably voted for, I would guess, somebody who probably voted for Trump in 2016, but Biden in 2020, because they just kind of thought Trump was, too mean and, let's get back to normal and stuff. This person couldn't stop talking to me about how idiotic that tax on capital gains was. They were so angry about it. I mean, that's the right word for it, angry. So if, regular normies are, can you imagine someone who has a lot of capital gains to deal with on a regular basis, wealthy people? I mean, my goodness. Sure, they know that this will never happen, but they don't want this idea to get normalized. They want this idea to be anathematized. So, that group doesn't like her. But I think institutional Washington also doesn't like her very much. There doesn't seem to be a lot of enthusiasm. The kinds of people who write for the New York Times, write for the Washington Post, if you read those people, the columnists, they're not real enthusiastic for Harris. The only group that I've seen that's enthusiastic for Harris are the neocons, but those guys are just nut jobs. They think that this is an opportunity for them to continue their crazy campaigns, and they hate Trump. So you really can't take them that serious. I mean, they have power, but you have to kind of qualify their support. But I really don't think that she just doesn't have a base. That's one of the big problems that she's going to run into. And a guy like Youngkin, who is a super connected guy. I mean, this guy is not some, guy from, a small town in Virginia. I mean, this guy, he's very connected. And, he also demonstrated that he has a good political antenna because he picked up on all the trouble in Loudoun County and rode that to the governorship. And people forget what happened there. That revolt in Loudoun County Now, I don't know if you know, you live in Virginia?
Yes, I remember that story well, but some of our
Yeah.
viewers might not.
Yeah, I mean, you had all of a sudden all the lunatics got a hold of the school board and started, doing all the stuff they wanted to do in schools, putting child porn in and having, perverts there running around in dresses, and, all the, I mean, it's unbelievable that the kind of stuff that they want to do. But, these parents, middle-aged white parents living in Loudoun County, and, Loudoun County is one of these places that's full of a lot of people who've lived other places. It's not, locals for the most part. A lot of them have government related jobs. They're in the private sector, but the company either does business with the government or does business with a government contractor. It's a very wealthy county. I think Loudoun County, it's in the top 10 of wealthiest counties in the country. It's like number 6 or something like that. But it's not so wealthy, as it's not full of rich people. It's full of upper middle class people. And these people freaked out over this stuff. They were fine with all the woke stuff when it didn't touch them or touch their kids, or a woke person didn't try to touch their kids. But as soon as it started coming into their community, they freaked out. And it turned into an issue that, that he could run on, and with popular sport. It was a populist issue in a way. And I watched him, Youngkin. He really did kind of change in a way. This is a guy who kind of started to enjoy being a politician. It wasn't an abstraction for him. All of a sudden, he was getting, real cheers from the kind of people he could appreciate. You know what I mean? And it wasn't canned speeches in front of canned audiences. All of a sudden, he felt like a man of the people. He really did change a lot. And I think, this is a guy that the people who actually run our country look at and say, this guy could be kind of the the Trumpism without Trump sort of thing, the compromise on the whole populist versus establishment thing. So he'll get a lot of support with his efforts to try and swing Virginia to Trump. I mean, that would be huge. That would be enormous if he pulled that off. I mean, this would be, because it would win the election. That would win the election for Trump. And of course, Trump would be told that he has to, owes this guy. So maybe put him in the cabinet or something like that, so he can get a high profile. So you can kind of see the wheels turning for a state like Virginia. But there's other states too. I mean, New Hampshire could be in play. That's a funny state. They have a lot of weirdos from Massachusetts who moved in and turned the state into a kind of a strange place. And you talk to people who live in New Hampshire. It's not that close. It's like I think a 5-point state right now, a 4-point state, something like that. But if the crazies aren't motivated, New Hampshire could be in play. I mean, it's it's one of those things. You start looking at this, it's not hard to find a scenario in which Trump actually has a really big night in election night. Oh, well, it all kind of breaks the same way. So I go back to what I originally said. All this stuff on the internet, all this gaslighting campaign, you just have to ignore it and look at the facts. If you're a betting man right now, you bet on Trump, and the shenanigans that would be required to beat him, and assuming he doesn't do anything stupid, is going to be enormous. It would take an enormous amount of shenanigans, and that could be a bigger problem for the regime than having Trump win and then have to deal with him for 4 years. The mistake I always make is thinking that crazy people are more reasonable than they are. But if I were advising the people who actually run the country, I'd say, you know what? Let Trump win, cut whatever deal you can cut with him. He'll be gone in 4 years, and you can start over with whoever you want. That would be the smart play.
Going back to your point about Kamala not having a base, look, conservatives are never particularly creative, right? And one of the things that they have kind of grabbed onto is this idea that Kamala has, shall we say, an ever-shifting perception of her own ethnicity, right? She's Indian, she's black, whenever it's kind of convenient. And obviously, right, you don't need to be particularly into politics to realize that black Americans as a voting bloc go massively for the Democrats, right? And one of the problems with this election in 2024 is, well, certainly, black Americans will continue to go for the Democrats. They don't seem to like Kamala in proportion to how they like other Democrats. and they like Trump more than they like other Republicans. And look, I'm not saying that the Republicans are going to break that demographic, right? They're going to become the party of black people. I think that's completely impossible. But you see that same pattern of Kamala failing to appeal to core parts of the Democratic base over and over again, right? Another clear example is Muslims, right? Muslims see her, by virtue of being associated with Joe Biden, as being overly sympathetic to Israel, right? That might not be the position that you or I take, but again, right, that is a valuable voting block in a place like Michigan. Even on a bigger level, right? We talked earlier about her kind of idiotic proposal to tax unrealized capital gains, which for those who aren't kind of up to date on what that means, basically, if you have an asset and it appreciates while you own it, you haven't sold it, you will be taxed on that unrealized gain, right? If your house goes up $100,000, even if you haven't sold it, you'll have to pay taxes on it. So, okay, there's the moneyed interests. There is, multiple minority groups. And then also, as we saw at the DNC in Chicago, the street movement, right? The kind of like protest wing of the party, who's very, very concerned with Israel-Palestine, they are also displeased with her. And really, it seems like the only demographic that loves Kamala Harris is like terminally online progressive women.
Yeah, that's, and of course the consulting class. She's raised she'll have a $1 billion or so to spend on political consultants, so they love it. People don't realize, that there's really a whole industry, particularly like polling. The polling guys. This is the time of the year they make a lot of money. They sell these ridiculous polls to these people. So those people love her. In a way, sort of professional Washington versus official Washington. They love both candidates in a way. Well, they don't love Trump, but typically they love both candidates. But her problem with the race issue is interesting because she's not black in the way in which Americans think of it. I spent my life around black people, and I lived in Baltimore for 20 years, and that they would not look at her as black. Now, they would look at Obama. They would understand that Obama. They could, let me put it this way: they would look past Obama being probably not, black in the sense that his ancestors were slaves, but he married a black woman, and he is kind of the ideal black guy. That's what he was presented as, sort of this, you see with Denzel Washington. He was that kind of guy, and this was a model they had created. They had tested. It goes back. I think I did mention this in another show. There was a guy named Kurt Schmoke back in the 1980s. He was like the prototype for Obama. They kind of worked out all the bugs in how to market this sort of suave, well-spoken, sophisticated sort of black guy, the kind of guy that back in the 70s, he would have been drinking Colt 45. But in this age, he's drinking Courvoisier. He's that kind of black guy. And that super excited black women, because black women looked at him and saw that he was married to sort of a prototypical black woman. I mean, she kind of looks, she's not a good looking woman. Well, they love this because it allowed them to feel as if, hey, you know what? That's attainable for me. And that's why the whole Obama thing worked, even though he wasn't really authentically black. Harris doesn't have that. She's married to a Jewish guy. She doesn't have any kids, which is very weird. Black women look at this, a black woman her age with no kids. They just do not understand how in the world you can try and pretend this is a black woman. And of course, she's married to a Jewish guy, and she's half Indian and half Jamaican or whatever. It just doesn't work. I mean, that was one of the really great things about Trump at that black journalist event. I laughed so hard watching it, and the crowd laughed. They were roaring because, he understands. Trump's been around a lot of black people. I mean, he used to hang out with, the boxing promoter, Don King. He used to hang around with, what the heck is the guy's name? The sort of Mr. Hanky looking black dude who's on TV. Used to be, what the heck is his name? That doesn't matter anymore. But, he was a street activist. The Reverend
Al Sharpton.
That's it. Al Sharpton. Yeah, that was a great story about Trump picking up Don King, and they brought Al Sharpton along. And Al Sharpton, Trump picked him up. His helicopter was taking him to Atlantic City for a fight or something like that. And Al Sharpton started talking out of turn, and Don King said, "Hey, it wouldn't be a problem if we threw you out of the helicopter." I mean, Trump understands how black people think. He's been around black people his whole life. He understands it. So when he sat up there and the way he talked about how the way he said it, suddenly she's a black person. And the way he enunciated black person, everybody cracked up because they understood exactly what he was saying. And I mean, I thought it was hilarious too. But black people are not going to be excited for her. It's just not going to happen. You know what she is? She's strong, diverse female character from every bad Hollywood film. You know, all these terrible Hollywood films where they find they're going to take something and make the protagonist, instead of being a man, which it should be, into strong, diverse, strong female. It's going to, and then every once in a while you have strong, diverse female. I think I mentioned The Acolyte, which I haven't seen. I've just seen all the videos making fun of it. But that's what she is. She's The Acolyte. She's this really crappy reinvention, this sort of feminist, heavily online feminist reinvention, of Barack Obama, basically, and trying to sell him that way. And it's just not going to work. I mean, black people are not going to get all excited. I mean, they'll vote 90% for Harris, but they won't vote in huge numbers. They're not going to be turning out in record numbers like they did for Obama or for Biden. In that, I mean, Joe Biden, for all his faults, he actually did a very good job courting the black vote, and they did a good job selling him as, this a good white, for the black people. And of course, they had spent 4 years telling black people that Trump was secretly going to bring back slavery. So, it worked, but it's not going to work now. I would not be surprised. And I keep coming back to this, and I don't want to I don't like to make predictions, but the more I talk about this stuff, the more I convince myself that Trump could actually win pretty handily. A month from now, we might be talking about this in an entirely different way. We might be talking about, a big victory, because Kamala Harris doesn't have a natural base. She has the poorest political instincts I've ever seen. She is a simpleton for sure. There's a video floating around today where she is talking about climate change, and what she says, and this is a carefully scripted interview with CNN, is Jabberwocky. It's nonsense words. There's no, you couldn't listen to what she said and come away with any meaning at all. And at a certain point, it becomes too much. There's too much that they've got to. There's too much weight in that sack to pull it up the hill, even with all the shenanigans.
I think there's one other problem with this, which is that Kamala Harris has to thread this uncomfortable needle of, on one hand, both lauding her accomplishments as the vice president, while also effectively running against that record. Because by any objective standard, the Joe Biden presidency has been just an out and out disaster, right? Obviously, foreign policy isn't normally a huge determinant in American elections, but I mean, that's not gone well. The economy, that's not gone well. And so, by any one of these traditional kind of bellwethers, right, these issues that are often cited for the success or the failure of a campaign, well, the Biden years were a disaster. And I think it's very, very difficult to say, well, yes, I was a fully competent vice president, the best vice president, right, the first woman of color, but also things are going to be completely different under me. I think that's a very difficult position to sell. And it's doubly difficult if you are an absolute incompetent moron.
Yeah, vice presidents don't do well following their boss. Al Gore ran in 2000, and he lost against a pretty terrible George Bush. George Bush wasn't a very good candidate. He wasn't a great speaker, and he was a guy who was sort of, they cleared the field for him, so he didn't really have to be tested. And Gore lost because he had this problem that every vice president has, and that is, on the one hand, he really can't take credit for the good times because he just stood around and went to funerals. I mean, everybody knows the vice president doesn't do anything. And on the other hand, he has to try and be his own man, which ultimately means saying that, well, I'm going to be different than my boss. So in good times, you're running against the good times. It just becomes a contradiction that's very difficult to overcome. The one exception was 1988 when George Bush, he ran, his basic campaign was, hey, I'm going to keep the good times rolling because it was really good times. And it was so good that people said, yeah, let's keep it going. And of course, the Democrats also ran, I would say up to this point, the worst candidate I've ever seen. I mean, Mike Dukakis was hilariously bad. I mean, even left-wing people made fun of him. I mean, Saturday Night Live used to make fun of him all the time. So, I mean, there was a lot of things fell in place. But generally speaking, vice presidents don't win. They might become president through death or, resignation or something like that. But, they don't typically do very well because, it's at that contradiction. You have to be your own person, but at the same time, you have to try and cling on to your boss's record. And it's a hard sell. And the problem that she has is that right now, the sort of thing that hangs over all of this like a fog is the concern about the decreasing competence we see. We see it everywhere. I run into this in my business life all the time. People constantly are talking about this problem of finding competent people and or dealing with competent people. It's a huge problem. I've been writing about the crisis of competence for 10 years now, and it's not getting better. And it shows up in people's radar when they see that people changing tires at an airport on a Boeing airplane. The tire explodes and kills two of them, or the Boeing airplane, the doors fall off of it mid-flight. This stuff keeps happening. It's part of what has really plagued the Biden administration, because back when they tried to get out of Afghanistan, which everybody thought was a good idea, they took what should have been a simple thing and screwed it up. And it just kind of reminded people, yeah, it's just all the people in charge are screw ups. And Harris is now running in this atmosphere where people are concerned about the lack of competence. It's on that Gallup poll. I think I talked about it in the show last week, and I know I've written about it. It's like the number 3 item, general competence. People are concerned that their government, that people in charge are idiots. Well, you run a woman who is, first of all, she repeatedly lied about the mental competence of her boss, and now she can't string a sentence together to save her life. It's just a really tough environment for her. In a lot of ways, the reason that no one else threw their hat in the ring to run this time is they all saw that this was just awful right now, to run as a Democrat. I think I compared her to Gerald Ford in 1976. She got the same problem. She didn't win the opportunity, and that weighs on people's minds. She was selected. They engineered her into this. She didn't have to run in primaries, and her boss is out of favor. And she's at the same time, though, she's got to try to defend it, and she's got all these problems, and it's a compressed campaign. And of course, Gerald Ford had the problem is that he didn't have a constituency either. There was really nobody that was willing to say, yeah, he's our guy. And I think that's what Harris is struggling with right now, is that this media campaign is great. It's fantastic. It works really well. It's cheap. It doesn't cost a ton of money. It's effective. It won the internet for 30 days or whatever it's been. But when she gets back to, when the campaign moves from the internet back to the meat space, all these problems are still there. They haven't gone away.
Yeah, I think that you're right. This kind of insane media push, right? And it's kind of funny. I keep talking about them because even a month later, they sound so incredibly out of touch, right? The whole Kamala is brat, JD Vance is weird saga, right? Which are hopefully sentences that will become increasingly incomprehensible to viewers as they get kind of further and further into the future. But there was nothing to it, right? It was pure media spin. The message behind both of those is basically it's high school girl stuff. It's right. We're cool. The people we don't like are gross weirdos. That's it. And okay, right. Let's game that out. 4 weeks later, that's vanished, right? Like vapor. And this bump Kamala had, well, first, she has a big dip after the DNC, right? The DNC was a disaster. And I'm not saying that as a partisan. Look, I've never voted in a presidential election. I will vote for Trump. this time. It would be my first vote. I'm not a MAGA person, but it was a disaster. And now, actually, just today, we've reached the inflection point, right? It has gone back to exactly what it was before that push. And don't get me wrong, right? The Democratic Party controls the media, maybe not explicitly, but they call the shots. So they can keep doing that. But I think there's the core problem that Kamala is a genuinely horrible candidate. So I want to pivot slightly to her running mate. Tim Walz, is that his name?
Yeah.
Okay. I always say it wrong because I have really no pre-existing thoughts about him whatsoever. But he's kind of an interesting figure because he really is the progressive vision of what a good white guy is, right? They did this video together where they're kind of in a very scripted manner joking around. And, they go through the kind of traditional white guy joke that you've heard. I mean, it was hackneyed 30 years ago, right? Oh, I'm a white guy from the Midwest. I put mayonnaise on my tacos. I don't like spicy food. I mean, it's effectively a minstrel show for white people, right? He's kind of jugging and jiving to appeal to his masters, right? You see the same thing with, him out in the field, right? He's a hunter. And then look, like I don't want to get too into kind of gun autism, but if you look at the gun, it's like a incredibly heavy, incredibly expensive, like $10,000 trap shooting shotgun.
Yeah,
right?
from
Not
Italy. Yeah.
Not all what you'd use to go shoot ducks, right? And when you dig even further, it's very clear that one, this guy has no appeal whatsoever, but two, he really is like the ideal version of what a white man is supposed to be in kind of modern progressive America, right? A torchbearer for a younger, kind of more diverse candidate. And I just don't see him going anywhere.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I've been calling him Elmer Fudd for a while, but it's interesting about this whole how they marketed him in Minnesota. Way back when, I'm pretty sure it was Mark Warner ran for Senate, or maybe he ran for governor. Maybe he ran for governor in Virginia. He was governor, right, in Virginia? I think he had been governor.
Yes, he was. He also had this is just an anecdote, he has the honor of having quite possibly the best election song ever, which I cannot play, but he basically just got a bunch of good old boys to write him a bluegrass song. It's actually pretty good. But anyway, back to you.
Well, I was doing business in Virginia, and local business guy. Well, I mean, super connected business guy, super connected in the Democratic Party, and he took me for a ride to see some of his properties he was developing or something like that. And in the back seat of his car, he had all this samples of promotional material that they were going to use for the Warner campaign, and it had him posing in the Elmer Fudd costume out in the field with the shotgun. And I think he had, there was one where he's sitting there, he's got blaze orange on, he's got his dog with him, and then, all that kind of stuff, right? And I forgot the guy. There was a guy, God, I forgot his name, was some sort of consultant. He was just really kind of an eccentric guy. But it was his idea, that they're going to sell, they're going to trick the good old boys, Republican voters with this costume act, this presentation, and obviously it worked. But they tried doing it later in 2004 with John Kerry. They dressed him up as Elmer Fudd, and of course it didn't work because John Kerry was just terrible at it. But they keep doing the Elmer Fudd act because it worked back in the Bush years. It worked as a way to kind of undermine conservative support in certain rural areas. I mean, it worked once. It's like every other trick, it works once. You get fooled, you don't fall for it again. But apparently they pulled this with Walz in Minnesota. I started laughing because that one picture they had him in his Elmer Fudd outfit with his $10,000 shotgun. You look at this, I'm like, wait a second. I'm pretty sure that was the picture they used for Warner. And I went online trying to find any old Warner campaign stuff, but I didn't find it. So, but it just kind of tells you the people behind this, they're extremely devious. They think about how to trick people. It's all about, coming up with some new narrative, some new character, some new way to deceive the public. And it's all kind of coalesced into this really fantastical Harris Walz campaign because, the real Walz, he's like, he's like 80% of the walls that they sold to people in Minnesota. Yeah, he was in the military. No, he wasn't in a war zone. He kept always kind of saying things that make you think that he was in combat. Well, it turns out that never happened. He wasn't really that guy. He'll say to people, well, as an old football coach, well, it turned out he volunteered for a year or two. He wasn't really a football coach. It's everything about this guy is kind of like this. And, of course, bringing him on a national stage, now people look into this and you can kind of see it. But Walz is such an odd guy because he's like David French. He's like, there's this weird sort of old white guy that I run into, not regularly, but on occasion, in that, it's almost like they hate themselves. They embrace all these old white women politics, but they're a white dude. They grasp onto all this really crazy liberal stuff, and I just don't know how these people. I just don't understand them. I mean, what's the point of this? Why did they do this? How do they find this personally fulfilling? I mean, I understand a guy like Walz, maybe had to do it to win election in Minnesota. Maybe, I don't know, but apparently he was doing this act before he got into politics. So he's just an odd guy. Men look at a guy like Walz and say, that's not a guy you can ever trust. He was very off-putting to normal males. Maybe he plays well with females. I don't know. But that's the problem with this campaign, though, is if you have a vice president who plays to the same audience that Kamala Harris is playing to, this very narrow, excessively online, unmarried, childless female, well, you're not going to win the election based on that demographic.
I think that and maybe this is too tinfoil hat, so feel free to call me on it, but I have some contacts in the finance world, right? Very influential guys. And, one of the things they've talked about is that, there's likely to be sort of a worsening recession over the short term, right? We're not talking Mad Max, but things becoming uncomfortable, right? That trend will continue, probably to, kind of a pain point. And, this guy was saying one of his theories is that basically the Democrats don't want 2024, or they don't want they don't want this election, because there's a likelihood that the economy kind of blows up in, the president's face, and they don't want to be the one, holding the bag. And, okay, maybe you don't believe that, but to me, it does seem like, kind of similarly to what you saw with the Conservatives in the UK, that the Democrats don't seem to be trying their hardest for this election. And I think one of the leading indicators of that is look at the candidate quality. Like, look, I hate Hillary Clinton, right? She's a horrible person, but she's an A-lister, right? That name has been around for a while. She can generate a lot of heat. Same thing with Joe Biden, right? Joe Biden's been around forever. But Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, like, these are backbenchers, right? These aren't real serious hitters. Do you think there's anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of there's a life cycle to a cycle within a party. Back in, say, the 1970s, and I mean, I wasn't around then, but the energy was all in this conservative movement that was building up within the Republican Party. And they had all these really great candidates and great public speakers and intellectuals and all this stuff. And then it burst into the scene in the 1980s. But it also did this at a time when the left was exhausted intellectually, emotionally, generationally. A lot of the candidates that were running were really just incredibly awful. People forget this stuff. I mean, I remember Walter Mondale being the presidential candidate. I mean, you would rather gouge your own eyes out and rip your ears off than sit and watch Walter Mondale talk about anything. I mean, it was just awful. And it was they had the same problem. But then the Republicans had this problem. They ran out of gas too. They just didn't have anybody. So there is kind of a seesaw effect here between the parties. And right now the Democrats are down for sure. But I also think that we're at a sort of an end cycle here, this post-Cold War cycle. Neoliberalism, neoconservatism, they've all run out of gas. I mean, Trump is a symptom. The reason that Trump exists is because the neocons, they wore the conservative movement like a skin suit. They directed it into things that people didn't generally want. People got wise starting at the end of the Bush years. And the Republican Party, the old Republican Party, the conservative movement is running on fumes. I mean, they got nothing. They're the Project 2025 business out of Heritage is an effort to try and glom onto this populist energy. But even the populist energy is kind of misdirected. People are just pissed. Basically, they don't. The average white person in America doesn't have a political party that represents their interests. So they're kind of, they're angry about it, but they don't have a way to talk about it. They don't have a language for it. They don't have a channel for that anger to flow into. So it kind of flows into Trump by default. But the big problem is happening on the Democratic side, I think, too. I think, I keep coming back to that Loudoun County revolt. I spent a lot of time looking into that because I think this is happening in a lot of places. I think a lot of upper middle class white people are looking around and thinking that we might have bigger problems than just Trump. We have other stuff. And certainly rich people, look, there's a lot of bad paper in the system. I don't know how much you know about finance, but there is a lot of really bad credit floating around in the system. The global financial arrangements are changing, and it doesn't appear as if right now anybody in Washington understands what the hell's happening. And, the smart money, the guys who are on Wall Street, I mean, they probably do know what's happening, and they probably understand that there is going to be a fair amount of pain as we transition out of the post-Cold War period into whatever we're going to call the next phase. But, there's across the spectrum, the people that are capable of thinking about this stuff are all looking around and saying that, we have a problem. And there really isn't anybody who is capable of addressing it within the sort of establishment system. Trump, for all his faults, does talk with some sort of with a degree of clarity about some of the issues, but otherwise there really isn't a lot of options. There needs to be a great regrouping right now for not only just the Democrats, because again, they don't have any. I mean, their candidate pool is terrible. I mean, look around. I mean, Gretchen Whitmer. I don't know how old you are, but when I was a young guy, back like in my 20s, late 20s, we used to have a thing called cougar bars, right? Gretchen Whitmer is the kind of woman that would be at a cougar bar. That's what she looks like. Every time I see her, I just start laughing. She's lost a bunch of weight. She's gotten into the gym. That's what she looks like. She's not somebody you make president. I mean, or governor for that matter. Gavin Newsom, if you watch this guy speak, he's terrible. He's awful. I mean, he's boring. It sounds like listening to your accountant. You can go through the list of their A-listers, and they sound like C-listers from even 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So there really is it's a big problem. They've got this. They've got to have a reset. They've got to kind of rethink things. They got to recruit new people. They got to find new ways to market themselves. And I'm not entirely sure it's going to happen without a lot of pain, because I think, for 30 years now, we've had a set of financial arrangements which are peculiar. They're not normal. The rest of the world was kind of just allowing us to lead them around, and now they're not. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And kind of getting back to what your point was, is that I don't think they're deliberately laying down. I just don't think they have a choice. They're just running out of good options right now.
Yeah, that's actually why, in the grander scheme of things, because I really share your analysis there, that to me, I'm voting for Trump because I have to live here, right? There's really nothing past that, right? Which is in the short to medium term, which will make my life better. I think that, don't get me wrong, I'd love to be proven cynical on this point, right? I'd love for in 4 years me to look back at this and say, oh, I can't believe I was so cynical. I was so black-pilled. But to me, I don't really see Trump fixing this at all.
No.
What I do see as kind of an interesting development is look at the people who are supporting Trump, right? Who've kind of thrown their weight behind him this election, the last one. Well, okay. I mean, we have, he's got AIPAC back, right? He's got Miriam Adelson. And I don't like those guys. I don't support the causes they do. And fair enough. But also, you have this kind of new kind of tech elite forming behind Trump. Obviously, the ones you always hear about are Thiel and Musk, right? Those are the big ticket guys. Yeah, I think that we've kind of forgotten about Vivek Ramaswamy, right? Who sort of served as a Trump stand-in, and then as soon as Trump announced he was out, well, he drops out of the race, and we can see that they have an inside seat because that's where Vance comes from, right? He's connected to those guys. Now, that goes a little bit deeper, right? And actually, this is another reason I think shenanigans are less likely. That you have Mark Zuckerberg, right, the CEO of Facebook, who was very much involved in the last round of shenanigans, basically saying, just in the last couple of days, 1, yes, that happened. 2, I'm sorry. And 1, I won't do it again. I think I got my numbers wrong there, but my point stands. And look, this doesn't mean that Mark Zuckerberg is suddenly my best friend, but it seems like we're seeing a new power block emerge. Now, I don't think this is the sort of power block that rejuvenates America, right? That takes us back to this kind of golden imperium. But there's competence there. There is energy there. And, if nothing else, I think that's a sector to watch.
Yeah, I completely agree with this. I mean, look, in 2016, Trump had no elite support. There were no billionaires signing up for Trump. I guess maybe Peter Thiel to some degree, but Thiel's an interesting character. I have some indirect dealings with him, and I don't think he's as politically savvy as people think. But that's a topic for another day. But Musk, who I think is to a great degree politically naive, but he's getting smart fast. But this is not a guy who is naive about the kinds of people who dominate politics. He's made all his money off of politics. People don't realize that most of his fortune comes from doing business with governments and getting government favors. The whole Tesla wouldn't exist without enormous subsidies from government, and not just the United States government, the Chinese government, the EU. This is a guy who understands the system and how to manipulate it. And I think his great concern about what's happening is a signal to the other oligarchs that it's okay to start questioning these hired men we have in the managerial class. What the hell are these guys actually doing? And so I do think there's something happening here. Now, it could devolve into civil war. It's always a possibility, but it's also possible that there's a reform movement afoot. Look, back in the 1970s, wealthy people, corporate interests, it was obviously a different world. They started to react not to the cultural stuff, but to the financial problems. They looked around and they saw that the money arrangements in the world were a problem. They saw the revolution coming with semiconductors and the microprocessor. There's a book I always recommend to people. It's called The Money Game, and the guy wrote it under a pen name. It's written in the 1960s about he wrote under the pen name Adam Smith. You read the book, it predicts everything that was going to happen with computerization in the financial markets. It's really it's a wild book to read, because you read it and you realize it's written in the 1960s, and it uses a lot of the sort of Mad Men type language. But all the predictions about what would happen in the 70s, 80s, and 90s are all right there. It's a great insight as to how the people at the very top of the system do know a hell of a lot more about what's coming down the road than the rest of us do. And these people saw this and they started to react to it. And we ended up with the conservative revolution with Reagan and all that stuff. But we also wound up with a revolution in the financial relations, for the money relations of the world. You got the Palace Accords, you got the Louvre Accords, you got the, 1974, you got the agreement with the Saudis that established the petrodollar. These were revolutionary changes. You had the beginning of deregulation that started. We're deregulated. I think it was Ma Bell got broken up, and then the airlines got deregulated. All this stuff happened. It was because the economic elites looked around and said, we have a problem. The system that we have is not working, and it's becoming dangerous. And so they pushed through a huge reforms. And that may be happening now. We might be on the cusp of it. The difference is that in the 1970s America was a different country demographically than 2020 2024 America. So, it's not a perfect analogy, but yeah, I mean, I do think that the rich people are concerned. I mean, look, if you're Elon Musk, you're Mark Zuckerberg, hell, you're a guy who's a president of a financial institution. You got to be looking at Durov getting arrested, the guy who runs Telegram in France, and think we have a real problem. I mean, that has got to be sending off loud alarms in every mansion around the globe. You don't arrest billionaires like that. It just doesn't happen. Not in the West, it is not supposed to happen that way. Even though he's Russian and all that other stuff, it should never have happened. They didn't arrest the guy, Abramovich, who owned, was it Manchester United, the big British soccer team? I mean, he's a Russian oligarch, and they didn't arrest him. Why are they arresting this guy? Something's changed. Brazil is now threatening Musk over censoring X. So yeah, I mean, I've kind of rambled here a little bit. Sorry about that, but it's a great topic. It's something that I think is happening, but you can't be sure where it's going to go. I think the economic elites, the oligarchs, are becoming increasingly concerned about what the hell's going on, and they don't worry about transgenderism and all that stuff, but they do worry about rich guys being arrested, financial system being shaky, the competency of the political class. So, we could find ourselves in very interesting times. Now, I just wish I was 20 years younger, because if it's going to all fall apart and there's going to be, people are going to be running around in the streets with guns, I'm too old to do that now.
Yeah, I think this might be a paraphrase from your show, right? But there's this idea that nothing changes until rich people get hurt, and I think that we're starting to see that. You cited obviously the regime coming after Musk, and I really do think that was a breakwater moment. One of the other names that gets thrown around in the mix here is Erik Prince, and Erik Prince really got screwed over by the government. Obviously, he's kind of a shady guy. He was involved with Blackwater. I have some personal contacts, right, who are friends of his, and they speak very well of him. But nonetheless, right, take a perfectly neutral view of the man. He is extremely wealthy, extremely competent, and extremely well connected. And the State Department screwed him over for basically no reason, right? For those who aren't familiar, effectively the State Department said, "Hey, can you send us some bulletproof vests?" and then sued him for sending them bulletproof vests without their permission, right? That's effectively what took down his company, right? Which of course is incredibly Kafkaesque and absurd, but that's a man who has an axe to grind with the government, to put it mildly. Now Musk, who's incredibly wealthy and powerful, has an axe to grind. And I think one of the reasons you see all of these tech CEOs, and again these finance guys like the CEO of Chase Bank, the CEO of Blackstone, I think, not BlackRock, basically aligning behind Trump, is that I think for a lot of people it's this kind of looking around saying like, wait a minute, I could be next, right? They could come after me for largely conflated reasons. And like you said, I don't know where this goes. I don't think any of these people are our guys, but at the same time, to be honest, I'd rather just have a government that works, that functions at the barest level, so that I don't have to, sincerely worry about, my safety or, things that would be almost, unthinkable 30, 40 years ago in America.
Yeah. I tell you, in my business life, I've always kind of chuckled, because often deals that I've been involved with, and when I was a younger guy in corporate America, I worked on some substantial deals, and it was weird how they kind of took a life of their own in a way, in that you went into it, you thought you understood all the facets of it, everybody you were working with thought they understood it, and it's just stuff just starts to happen, and before long you're not really working on the deal you thought you were. You're working on something else. Sometimes it gets really big, it becomes more complex. And it's just, we as human beings, we're limited, and we can't see around corners. We don't always see all the facts, and we can't think beyond a few moves, and all that kind of stuff that people know. And you see this happen in politics. Donald Trump came down that elevator in 2015, not expecting to be president of the United States. That was obvious. But he wound up saying things about immigration in particular that caught fire. It was like he threw a cigarette out of his car and set the prairie on fire. I mean, he didn't intend to do it. It wasn't what he was thinking about. It wasn't a plan. It just sort of happened. My analysis of Trump in his first year is that a first term as president was he just got swept up. This is a guy who had thrived his whole life in chaos, but was unprepared for the degree of chaos that had happened. This thing that happened. Glenn Youngkin winning the governorship. I watched that, and look, I have some idea what Glenn Youngkin was like before. All of a sudden, things just kind of took off, and he was just riding the tiger. And it changes you when you're in that kind of circumstance. When all of a sudden, you go from 0 to 1, to quote Peter Thiel. It changes how you look at the world. You look at things in a different way. You look at yourself in a different way. And I think that's happening with Musk. I think it certainly happened with Trump. I think it's happened a second time with Trump when he got shot. I think that changed his demeanor since then has been different, and you can see it. He's much more serious, and he may be overthinking things a little bit. But I think he had that moment where he realized that, hey, wait a second, I'm a world historical figure. My life now has meaning beyond just being good at the stuff I enjoy being good at. And I think that could be what happens with us as a country as a whole. All these rich guys are looking around, they're seeing these problems. They look at the rampant dishonesty. This arresting of Durov. I cannot believe they did that. That is such an insanely stupid idea. Because it's not. I mean, who cares about Durov? Who cares about Telegram? If it went away, the world wouldn't change that much. It's the symbolism of it. It's what it appears to be. And there's so many things like that, and it's representative of this sort of dishonesty of the managerial class. And we look at these people as our bosses, but the rich guys, the oligarchs, the guys like Elon Musk, the guys like Mark Zuckerberg, they look at these people as their employees. And all of a sudden they find, imagine yourself, you're running a company, and all the guys who, or you're not running the company, you own the company, and you have a meeting with all your C-level people, and they're all lying to you. What do you do? Well, you get rid of all of them. You start thinking about how I get rid of all of them and I bring new people in. And that may be what's happening with a lot of these guys because of the constant lying, the dishonesty, the unwillingness to abide by the rules. So, we could be in for some very interesting times. And you know what? I mean, it may be necessary. Interesting times might be the kind of thing that fixes a lot of the spiritual and cultural problems that we have. You see, you see this stuff too. People talking about the fertility rate and the loss of community and social capital breaking down and all that. Maybe we need a really serious crisis that focuses everyone's mind on what's important, and a ruling class that is doing it at the same time we are. Maybe that's just a necessary thing to have the renewal that we're going to need, not just as a country, but as a civilization.
I thought the same thing, that, there's this desire to sort of, have your cake and eat it too, right? This desire to become, a vitalistic living society again without going through anything unpleasant. And I'm not entirely sure that that's how it works, right? Forgive me for a minute, right? But this is something that you see all the time in, both the entire Western canon, right? But then in scripture, right? This idea that, that a people kind of falls away from, the path, right? They reject God. They do something shameful, and they need to atone for that, right? There's a blood price that needs to be paid. And I don't want to take this into an overly chin-stroking direction, but I think that applies to us as well. That these sort of interesting times are probably the only way we get to a society that has a reason to exist again. And I think that, the kind of like endless chanting about 1776 shall commence again from the morbidly obese boomers, I think is probably a little bit of wishful thinking. But Z-Man, we are coming up on time. I really enjoyed this conversation. It went different places than I thought, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. But if people want to find more of you and your work, what's a good way for them to do so?
Just go to thezman.com. That's the easiest place. All my links are there. I even have links to John Darbyshire stuff. He's one of the old graybeards who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. I wouldn't be here without John Darbyshire. So I'm now that VDare went out of business. I'm now supporting and distributing John's weekly podcast. And if you want to hear a real old head, a guy who's been at this, the guy who actually coined the term dissident right. If you want to know what the old guys are thinking, then just go to thezman.com. I put his show up every Saturday morning.
Well, I'll be sure to link to that. I actually didn't realize you were publishing his work now. I'm not as familiar with his sort of recent work, but there are a couple of John Darbyshire essays that are all-time classics. I'm definitely going to have to check that out. As far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I've really been enjoying the recent groundswell of reviews. Your reviews make me laugh consistently, and so I highly appreciate it. You can also check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. And to everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.